Welcome back, friends, and thank you for choosing History with Hampson for all of your history needs. I know there are a lot of options out there. I am so glad that you've chosen me. Before we start, I just wanted to express a concern of mine about something that has been really weighing on my thoughts these last couple of days. What is the state of Gavin's hair? It has been 4 weeks since I last saw that mess. I am hopeful that he has some clippers at home and took care of that mess. Previously on this class, we discussed the not so roaring side of the 1920s that highlighted tension. It was a look at nativism through congressional legislation, the treatment of Italian anarchists, and the rise of a newer version of the Ku Klux Klan that added nativism and anti Catholicism to already existing racism. The divide within Protestantism over Darwinian evolution, dries versus wets, and the failure that was prohibition. We also looked at the rise of Republicans in the 1920s. These were not the progressive Republicans like Roosevelt, Taft, and La Follette. Presidents Harding, Coolidge, and Hoover were throwbacks to the Gilded Age, with a focus on business, much of which was crafted by the man who served as all three presidents' Secretary of Treasury, Andrew Mellon. We finished with the crippling Great Depression, the biggest economic downturn in American history. 25% of Americans lost their jobs, thousands of banks closed, and with those banks, people's life savings were gone. Global trade ground to a halt, and Americans found themselves looking for their government to do something. Today, we will look at two very different responses to the crisis from two very different presidents. While the Great Depression will not end by the time I finish, what Americans expect from their government most certainly will. It's Chapter 25, The Great Depression. Herbert Hoover had succeeded at just about everything he did before his election to the presidency in 1928. He was an entrepreneur, attended Stanford University, and became the world's foremost mining engineer, and was a self made millionaire many times over before his 40th birthday. Hoover led the effort to successfully evacuate Americans from London at the beginning of World War I, before leading the effort to feed starving Belgians impacted by the war through the Commission for the Relief of Belgium. President Wilson brought him home to run the American Food Administration. Both parties flirted with selecting him as their nominee in 1920, but ultimately he was selected as Secretary of Commerce under President Harding, a job he continued in under President Coolidge. When the Mississippi River flooded in 1927, Hoover was the one called to manage the relief effort. He was known as the Master of Emergencies. Initially, Hoover did not do much but wait for recovery and reassure the panicked American public. By October 1930, the stock market had recovered 75% of what it had lost a year earlier. It is not fair to say that Hoover did not respond to the Great Depression. His efforts were ultimately overshadowed by his predecessor and proved ineffective. His initial response was known as voluntary association that emphasized cooperation between business, labor, and agricultural leaders to work together to help curtail the effects of the Great Depression. His attempts to prevent labor unions to not demand pay increases or better hours, and businesses from cutting production or laying off workers, ultimately collapsed under an economy that would see 20% of banks fail, 12 million Americans losing their jobs, and see the national income drop from 87.4 billion to 41.7 billion during his presidency. Hoover believed that charities were a better source of relief for the American people than the government. If the responsibility fell to the federal government, Hoover claimed that America would be plunged into socialism and collectivism. Hoover's reluctance to ask Congress to do much would correspond with his declining popularity during his presidency. As Americans blamed the president for the economy, we saw the emergence of Hoovervilles. These were shanty towns set up by the unemployed outside of American cities. Newspapers were rebranded as Hoover blankets as a means to keep warm from those sleeping outside. A Hoover flag was an empty pocket turned inside out. Hoover spoke to all 48 governors about instituting public works projects in their states. Hoover did call on Congress to authorize $423 million for federal public works. Concerned with deficits, Hoover proposed raising taxes. Another action taken by the president was his support of the 1930 Trade Act, better known as the Hawley-Smoot Tariff, which increased tariffs and resulted in a dramatic decline in global trade. Europeans responded with retaliatory tariffs. Ultimately, global trade declined by 25%. The reduction in farm exports devastated an already devastated farm economy. Needless to say, this did not have the effect that Hoover was looking for. As Hoover biographer Richard Norton Smith said of the tariff, it, at the worst possible time, built walls around the American economy and encouraged other countries to do the same. Hoover placed a debt moratorium on payments owed to the United States from Europe in the wake of World War I, as the economies of Europe continued to collapse. Through the Agricultural Marketing Act, the Hoover administration tried to stabilize farm prices, an effort that was undermined by the aforementioned Hawley-Smoot tariff. Hoover's response did not prove effective in reversing the tide of the Great Depression. In 1930, Democrats won control of Congress for the first time since Woodrow Wilson and the Democrats lost control in 1918. Hoover's advisors urged him to give a weekly radio address to help comfort Americans, but Hoover refused. He was not nearly as effective on the radio as his predecessor would prove to be. Heading into an election year in 1932, Hoover supported bills that attempted to keep banks open and protect homeowners from foreclosure. In 1932, he signed the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, which provided emergency loans to failing banks, railroads, and other businesses. The law also made federal funds available to local governments, public works projects, and relief efforts. This can be considered Hoover's signature response to the Great Depression. The Reconstruction Finance Corporation made more than $1 billion available to help combat the Great Depression, but an overwhelming majority of that money was never distributed. The money that was distributed went to big banks and corporations. The idea that the benefit of propping up these institutions would trickle down to the American people never materialized. Thus, the Reconstruction Finance Corporation did not have any real impact. Congress approved the payment of a $1,000 bonus for veterans of World War I in 1924. These bonuses were to be paid in 1945. As a result of the Great Depression, veterans demanded that they be paid immediately in 1932. Hoover, more concerned with balancing the budget, rejected these pleas. In June 1932, 5 months before a presidential election, 20,000 veterans who called themselves the Bonus Expeditionary Force, a play on the American Expeditionary Force that went off to Europe to fight Germany during World War I, descended upon the nation's capital, promising to stay until the bonuses were paid. In mid July, Hoover ordered the police to clear the marchers out of abandoned federal buildings and the camps where they were staying. After rocks were thrown at the police and someone opened fire, 2 veterans were dead. Hoover, again in an election year, called in the United States Army to help the police clear out the marchers. General Douglas MacArthur led the effort, assisted by Dwight Eisenhower, and his actions exceeded the orders of the president. There were machine gun detachments, there were tanks rolling down Pennsylvania Avenue, chasing these World War I veterans across the Anacostia River, where the Bonus Army's tent city was burned to the ground. 100 veterans were injured. This would not be the last time General Douglas MacArthur would have a problem following orders from the commander in chief. Hoover, with this as a backdrop, faced re election in 1932. We will get to that right after this. I wanted to take a moment to share my experiences photographing the golden snub-nosed monkey in China for the magazine. You see me there on the bottom right. That is one of my favorite hats. I wear it all the time. Here to confirm this fact is my loving wife. Honey, tell these almost adults how much I love this hat.
I hate that hat. Every time I try to put it in the pile for goodwill, he takes it back out.
Okay, not the endorsement I was looking for. Anyways, these pictures were taken in the Foping National Nature Preserve, located in the Shanxi province in the Qinling Mountains, which run east to west across central China. I consider myself lucky to have had the opportunity to see this endangered species in its natural habitat. Nasma ekel was an impressive animal. It is a word meaning heir to the king. It is a name reserved for the best of the best. Think of Nasma from my time in Brazil. The future is bright for this monkey, and he is one of my all time favorites. Franklin Delano Roosevelt got his start in politics as a state senator from New York in 1910. He was a distant cousin of President Theodore Roosevelt. In 1913, he was chosen as Assistant Secretary of Navy, the same position held by his cousin. And by 1920, at the age of 38, he was chosen as the running mate for James Cox, who would go on to lose to Warren G. Harding in the election of 1920. Then in 1921, he contracted polio, leaving him paralyzed from the waist down. Roosevelt would rarely be photographed in a wheelchair, and until right before his death in 1945, did not give speeches sitting down, utilizing braces on his legs to remain upright. Roosevelt was elected governor of New York in 1928. The same year, fellow New Yorker and his predecessor as governor, Al Smith, lost to Herbert Hoover. In a speech at the Democratic National Convention in 1928, which was the first convention to be aired on the radio, Roosevelt showcased how the radio could be used effectively to reach the American people when he gave a speech nominating Smith as the Democratic nominee. 4 years later, Roosevelt would be the first presidential candidate to go to the convention and accept his party's nomination. It was there that he said, I pledge myself to a new deal for the American people. Let us all here assembled constitute ourselves prophets of a new order of competence and courage. This is more than a political campaign, it is a call to arms. Give me your help, not to win votes alone, but to win this crusade to restore America to its own people. It was this call to action, this promise of a New Deal for the American people, that would propel FDR to the presidency in 1932 in a landslide. I think that these political campaign buttons from the race highlight the difference. Americans no longer wanted to play it safe, they needed a change. Inauguration Day 1933 would be the last one that took place on March 4th. The period between the election of FDR and the inauguration of FDR was a bit of a disaster. President Hoover and President-elect Roosevelt did not really communicate, and the economy of the United States continued to worsen. The American banking system started to collapse during this period, and Hoover believed that FDR wanted the economy to reach the bottom before taking office so that Roosevelt could get all of the credit for the recovery. Here are the two men on their way to the inauguration on March 4th, 1933. In order to shorten the period of time between the election of a president and his or her inauguration, this is known as the Lameduck Period, the 20th Amendment was passed and ratified. It changed the day of the inauguration to January 20th. And it was on March 4th, 1933, that Roosevelt spoke to the American people for the first time as their president. He famously said, "So first of all, let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself, nameless, unreasoning, unjustified terror which paralyzes needed efforts to convert retreat into advance." With these words, the approach to combating the Great Depression would dramatically change, and with it, the role the federal government would play in the American economy. Roosevelt's election ushered in what I will call modern liberalism. His political worldview was influenced by the populism of William Jennings Bryan and the progressivism of Woodrow Wilson. Roosevelt believed that the government should play an active role in the economy. His approach can be best described as active. His administration looked to attack the Great Depression by focusing on three R's: relief for those out of work, recovery for businesses in the American economy, and reform of economic institutions to try and ensure that something like the Great Depression would never happen again. There are a lot of political cartoons focusing on FDR. This one shows FDR as the doctor treating a sick Uncle Sam. You will notice all of the bottles on the table representing different New Deal cures for the economy. While each one did not always accomplish its goal, each one did represent something being tried by the federal government. When we discuss the New Deal, we have to learn a whole new alphabet: PWA, WPA, CWA, AAA, TVA, FDIC, CCC, just to name a few. Roosevelt got 15 pieces of legislation through Congress in his first 100 days in office. Ever since Roosevelt, presidents are assessed by his 100-day metric. No one has come close to Roosevelt, who had a Congress willing to try whatever the president wanted. Congress repealed the 18th Amendment by proposing the 21st Amendment, which was ratified by the states in 1933. Roosevelt also effectively used the radio to reach the American people through what came to be called his fireside chats. In these addresses, Roosevelt spoke slowly and used language that most Americans could understand. Here is an example from FDR's first fireside chat on March 12, 1933.
Ladies and gentlemen, the President of the United States. My friends, I want to talk for a few minutes with the people of the United States about banking, to talk with the comparatively few who understand the mechanics of banking, but more particularly with the overwhelming majority of you who use banks for the making of deposits and the drawing of checks. I want to tell you what has been done in the last few days and why it was done and what the next steps are going to be. I recognize that the many proclamations from state capitals and from Washington, the legislation, the Treasury regulations, and so forth, couched for the most part in banking and legal terms, ought to be explained for the benefit of the average citizen. I owe this in particular because of the fortitude and the good temper with which everybody has accepted the inconvenience and the hardships of the banking holiday. And I know that when you understand what we in Washington have been about, I shall continue to have your cooperation as fully as I have had your sympathy and your help during the past week. First of all, let me state the simple fact that when you deposit money in a bank, the bank does not put the money into a safe deposit vault. It invests your money in many different forms of credit, in bonds, in commercial paper, in mortgages, and in many other kinds of loans. In other words, the bank puts your money to work to keep the wheels of industry and of agriculture turning round. A comparatively small part of the money that you put into the bank is kept in currency, an amount which in normal times is wholly sufficient to cover the cash needs of the average citizen. In other words, the total amount of all the currency in the country is only a comparatively small proportion of the total deposits in all the banks of the country. What then happened during the last few days of February and the first few days of March? Because of undermined confidence on the part of the public, there was a general rush by a large portion of our population to turn bank deposits into currency or gold. A rush so great that the soundest banks couldn't get enough currency to meet the demand. The reason for this was that on the spur of the moment, it was of course impossible to sell perfectly sound assets of a bank and convert them into cash except at panic prices far below their real value. By the afternoon of March 3rd, a week ago last Friday, scarcely a bank in the country was open to do business. Proclamations closing them in whole or in part had been issued by the governors in almost all of the states. It was then that I issued the proclamation providing for the national bank holiday.
You get the point. We will get to that very bank holiday in just a minute. In these addresses, he would describe the problem, tell the American people how his administration was dealing with the problem, and try to inspire confidence into Americans. It was the action that I'm about to start describing that made FDR so popular with most Americans at the time. In the wake of 4 years of an abysmal economy and a president whose efforts were ineffective, Americans wanted to be confident that their government was willing to act. The rest of this presentation will highlight the many actions taken by the Roosevelt administration. Not all accomplished their goals, and by the time that World War II broke out in Europe in 1939, unemployment was still in double digits. But in March 1933, the most pressing issue facing the new president was the American financial system. When he took office, the rate of bank and business failures had reached an all-time high, with millions of Americans having lost everything. 32 states had already closed all of their banks when FDR became president, and in those states where banks remained open, individuals could not withdraw more than 5% of their money. 2 days into his presidency, Roosevelt closed all the banks in the United States to prevent further collapse, calling it a bank holiday. Who does not love a holiday? The Emergency Banking Relief Act gave the government the authority to decide which banks would reopen and which ones would not. 3/4 of the banks opened within 3 days, and more than $1 billion would be deposited into the banks. Notice the cartoon. FDR is the banker, accepting the people's deposits of confidence. The clip I just played you was FDR speaking to the American people 8 days into his presidency about this very issue. The Glass-Steagall Act created the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, which guaranteed all bank deposits up to $2,500. This meant that if the bank closed, the government would give people their money back. Today, the government insures up to $250,000. If you actually go into a bank, I'm not sure who still does that, but some do, you should see this symbol on the right. If you don't, do not leave your money there. To help homeowners, the Homeowners Loan Corporation allowed for refinancing of homes to prevent foreclosures. When we discussed the 1920s, I talked about how American farmers entered into the Great Depression before the rest of the economy. Last time, I discussed the Dust Bowl and how steeply the farm economy had started to fall under Herbert Hoover. Roosevelt's attempt to heal this sector of the economy included providing low interest loans and mortgages to farmers to help keep them above water on their land through the Farm Credit Administration. Falling farm prices was another major issue facing American agriculture. Roosevelt had Congress pass the Agricultural Adjustment Administration. The AAA paid farmers subsidies to produce less, to end agricultural surpluses, and to prevent the price of agricultural commodities from continuing to decline. Specifically, the act gave farmers money to grow less corn, wheat, cotton, rice, and tobacco. 6 million pigs were killed and buried to help raise the price of pork. The government set limits on these products. This did help stabilize the price of farm commodities as farm incomes increased over the course of the first 3 years of the New Deal. Critics argued that the law favored big farmers over small farmers, as they had more land, so not cultivating it did not hurt them nearly as much. It also hurt the sharecroppers who farmed much of this land for big farmers and now found themselves with nothing to farm. While the law was declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court in 1936, Congress passed a revised law in 1938. Farm prices increased by 58% before the law was declared unconstitutional. Congress also passed the Rural Electrification Act, which helped bring many rural areas into a more modern era by providing electricity for the first time. Roosevelt, in an attempt to set his policies apart from those of 1920s Republicans that, in his opinion, allowed for the Depression to occur, threw some shade at Herbert Hoover when he said that his policies were an enormous step away from laissez-faire. If that philosophy hadn't proven bankrupt, Herbert Hoover would be sitting here right now. The Roosevelt administration attempted to help workers in the industrial economy by relaxing antitrust laws and providing better protections for workers, allowing them to unionize and to engage in collective bargaining. Collective bargaining is when owners and the workers sit down and negotiate terms of employment. The National Recovery Administration called on businesses to pay fair wages, between 30 and 40 cents an hour, accept a maximum work week, between 35 and 40 hours, and abolish child labor. The government was able to set prices. These were the same types of actions we saw from the Wilson administration during World War I. Ultimately, these laws were not effective, as bigger corporations were able to play a large role in writing the rules to benefit themselves, oftentimes at the expense of smaller companies. Also, the lack of an enforcement mechanism rendered the act inefficient. In 1935, the Supreme Court declared the law unconstitutional in the Schechter case. The Roosevelt administration would address many of these issues later. We will talk about FDR's approach to unemployment right after this. And now for a couple of things I just thought you needed to know. 40,000 Americans are injured by toilets each year. This absolutely baffles me. An ant is absolutely stronger than you. It can lift 50 times and pull 30 times its own weight. And lastly, in the United States, more toilets flush at halftime of the Super Bowl than any other time of the year. This seems so obvious, and there cannot be a very close second. What else is even close? In 2019, 99 million people watched the Super Bowl. The second most watched show was the AFC Championship game at 54 million. The third was the NFC Championship game at 33 million. And fourth was the Academy Awards at 30 million. As I have previously stated, unemployment peaked at 25% in 1933 as Roosevelt was coming into office. One of the first steps taken by the Roosevelt administration was the Federal Emergency Relief Administration, which gave federal money to state and local governments to provide relief for those in need. The New Deal would usher in a national welfare system for the first time in American history. The PWA gave money to state and local governments to build bridges, hospitals, schools, airports, and other large scale construction projects that employed tens of thousands of Americans, building up American infrastructure and providing needed job opportunities. The Civilian Conservation Corps put millions of young men to work in camps set up in national parks and forests, developing parks, planting trees, and building reservoirs. These young men lived in camps that were segregated by race. This is not surprising. This is America in the 1930s. While most were restricted to white men, there were some opportunities for African Americans, Mexicans, and Native Americans. These men were required to send almost all of their pay home to their families. The Tennessee Valley Authority built dams in the Tennessee River Valley. This act had a dramatic impact on this part of the country, which stretched from the northeast corner of Mississippi to southwestern Virginia. By bringing affordable power, altering the landscape by ending flooding in the area, and bringing economic opportunity to this impoverished part of the country. The New Deal did not end at the 100-day mark. Congress continued to pass legislation for the remainder of the 73rd Congress. The Civil Works Administration put millions of Americans to work on smaller public works projects. The SEC was created to regulate and watch over the stock market so as to avoid the speculation that helped bring on the crash 5 years earlier. The Federal Housing Administration was set up to ensure mortgages for new construction as well as home repairs. FDR and his New Deal were very popular with the American people, allowing for Democrats to increase their majority in the midterm elections of 1934. But the Roosevelt administration was not without its critics. FDR found himself receiving criticism from conservatives from the right who thought he was doing too much, liberals from the left who thought he was not doing enough, and even the Supreme Court who thought what he was doing was unconstitutional. Conservative criticisms of FDR focused around how much power the federal government assumed under the New Deal. We can see in these criticisms many arguments that are prevalent in modern American politics. The federal government had too much power. The legislation was socialist, even communist. There were concerns over growing deficits and too much government regulation. The American Liberty League started when the DuPont family called a meeting of business leaders in the offices of General Motors in New York to discuss opposition to the New Deal. They argued that the New Deal gave the president dictatorial powers and threatened free enterprise. Liberal critics, including actual socialists and communists, actually thought that the FDR administration was doing too much to support business and not enough for those Americans who needed the most support. What had the president done for women, minorities, or the elderly, some asked. There were three prominent voices against the president during this time period that had large national followings. First, Dr. Francis Townsend, who mobilized millions of Americans behind his idea for a federal pension for elderly Americans. The Townsend Plan, as it was called, would give every American over 60 years old $200 a month if they retired. The money had to be spent each month, thus putting money back into the economy. This would also free up job opportunities for younger Americans. While this plan never passed Congress, it did lay the groundwork for support of Social Security, which we will get through Congress in just a few minutes. Father Charles Coughlin was an anti-Semitic Catholic priest who used the radio to criticize FDR over monetary policy to one of the largest radio audiences in the country. And finally, Huey Long was a governor turned senator from Louisiana who went from supporting Roosevelt to calling him a dictator. Interestingly, Long had been called a dictator by critics in Louisiana when he was governor. His Share Our Wealth plan was a plan to redistribute wealth to end the Great Depression. This plan, paid for by taxing the richest Americans, would give each family a $5,000 homestead and an annual wage of $2,500. His Share Our Wealth Society, with the motto, "Every Man a King," had millions of followers across the country. Long had presidential aspirations, but was assassinated by the son-in-law of one of his political rivals in 1935. In response to these critics and the fact that the Great Depression was still ongoing, FDR launched what has been called the Second New Deal. This Second New Deal was more focused on relief and reform. The Works Progress Administration was like the PWA and the CWA, but much bigger in funding and scope. It hired millions of Americans to build or renovate more than 100,000 public buildings, construct nearly 600 airports, build more than 500,000 miles of roads, and over 100,000 bridges. It also assisted the arts, offering employment to writers, artists, musicians, and actors and directors. The Resettlement Administration provided aid to poor farmers through loans and migrant work camps. In the Second New Deal, the president was much more critical of business and more focused on the working class. The National Labor Relations Act, better known as the Wagner Act, replaced the National Industrial Recovery Act, which had been deemed unconstitutional. The act created the National Labor Relations Board, which would enforce provisions guaranteeing labor's rights to unionize and collectively bargain. The Revenue Act of 1935 was a wealth tax, known by conservatives as the Soak the Rich Bill. It dramatically increased taxes for the most wealthy Americans by taxing excess wealth, capital gains, which is the profit from the sale of property or investments, and gifts from parents to children. This was a response to Huey Long's Share Our Wealth plan. Social Security is one of the lasting reforms of the New Deal. It is one that politicians do not like to talk about because any changes to Social Security will likely upset the group of people who vote at a much higher percentage than you guys do, older Americans. But the Social Security Act, a response to the Townsend Plan, was not just a pension for older Americans when they reached the age of 65. It also provided unemployment insurance for those Americans who needed temporary assistance from the government after losing their job, and federal aid to individuals with disabilities, and aid for children whose father had died, provided to the mother until the child reached the age of 18. The election of 1936 was a referendum on Franklin Delano Roosevelt and the New Deal. Kansas Governor Alf Landon did not stand a chance, especially when the economy started showing signs of recovery in 1936. This election was one of the biggest landslides in American history. Charles Evan Hughes ran and defeated William Randolph Hearst for governor of New York in 1906. 4 years later, he was appointed to the Supreme Court by President Taft. 6 years after that, in 1916, he stepped down from the court and unsuccessfully ran for president against Woodrow Wilson. In 1921, he was selected by President Harding to serve as Secretary of State, one of Harding's competent cabinet picks. He would hold this position through the first part of the Coolidge presidency. Then in 1930, President Hoover selected Hughes to serve as the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. In 1933, the Supreme Court consisted of 4 conservative justices, known as the Four Horsemen, 3 liberal justices, and 2 swing votes, Owen Roberts and, yes, Charles Evan Hughes. At the beginning of the Roosevelt administration, Hughes and Roberts joined the liberal wing of the court on a series of 5-4 rulings in favor of the New Deal. But in the winter of 1935, the court started striking down laws as unconstitutional. In an 18-month period, the Hughes court struck down more than a dozen New Deal laws. An enraged FDR came up with a plan to strike back against this roadblock. His solution? Add more justices to the Supreme Court. Imagine a world where President Clinton or Obama or President Bush or Trump suggested a plan to add as many as 6 justices to the Supreme Court. I think one's reaction to this scenario might depend on which president is doing the selecting. In short, there would be outrage. And there was outrage when FDR suggested this restructuring of the Supreme Court in 1937. Every president, even the most popular, has those moments where even their most ardent supporters shake their head. Lincoln had the suspension of the writ of habeas corpus during the Civil War. FDR, who was president for 12 years, had a few. There were his relationships with Lucy Mercer and Missy LeHand, but I'm not interested in who the president may or may not have slept with. We will talk about FDR and the internment of the Japanese during World War II next time. For now, let's focus on FDR's plan to pack the Supreme Court. This plan, which conservatives called the court packing scheme, or Roosevelt's attempt to fill the Supreme Court with liberal justices who would not vote against his New Deal legislation, called for adding 1 new justice for every sitting justice over the age of 70 years and 6 months old. There are many political cartoons from this time period that were versions of the one you see right there. On March 9th, 1937, FDR took to the radio and compared this court crisis, as the president would describe it, to the banking crisis he spoke about 4 years earlier. He argued that there was a need to, quote, save the Constitution from the court and the court from itself. The Judiciary Reorganization Bill of 1937 would add 6 new justices to the court. When it failed to pass Congress, it marked the first loss for FDR in Congress during his presidency. His approval rating fell from 65 to 51%. Ultimately, Roosevelt's problem would take care of itself, as he would go on to appoint 8 justices to the court between 1937 and 1943. On the same day in 1941, FDR elevated Harlan Stone to Chief Justice and appointed 2 new Associate Justices to the High Court. With this turnover, FDR would no longer face the threat of judicial review from the Supreme Court. Politically, this episode marked a turning point, as Congress would no longer vote for whatever the president wanted like it had during his first term. We're almost done. We'll get to a major victory for the American worker, impacts of the New Deal on different parts of American society, and what all this means, right after this. I wanted to take a moment to talk about the time I spent in Norway several years ago on assignment for the magazine. You can see me there on the bottom right, enjoying some downtime, fishing on the Gudbrandsdalslagen River in Norway. I have fished on all of the major rivers in Norway. It was here that I encountered Nasmahael, which means one who is most precious. It is a word that describes a person whose outer beauty matches their inner beauty and is an exemplar for kindness. I have never met a sweeter, more beautiful animal. I first photographed her 9 years ago and am certain that she will grow up and do great things. Going back to the Gilded Age, I showed you this image on the bottom left of what labor wanted. 8 hours for work, 8 hours for rest, and 8 hours to do whatever they wanted to do. While there were some gains during the Progressive Era, it was not until 1938, in the passage of the Fair Labor Standards Act, that workers were awarded the protections they enjoy today. This bill set a maximum work week at 40 hours and said that employers had to pay workers time and a half for anything over 40 hours or overtime. If you work an hourly job, your employer has to pay you time and a half for any time worked over 40 hours. It set a minimum wage at 25 cents. Back in my day, I made $4.25 an hour working at McDonald's. It also set rules for child labor. The law held up in court and has been the standard for American workers ever since. Eleanor Roosevelt was a champion for not only the rights of women, but for many Americans. She was the leader of the women's division of the Democratic Party in New York before becoming the head of the women's division of the Democratic National Party in 1928. This was in a period after the ratification of the 19th Amendment, when the 2 major parties did not want women to go along with Alice Paul's National Woman's Party. The Democratic Party and the Republican Party created women's divisions in 1917 and 1918, respectively. As First Lady, Eleanor Roosevelt defined the role of First Lady, taking on issues and traveling the country in support of things she deemed important. One example was when Marian Anderson, a famous African-American singer, was not allowed to perform in the auditorium of the Daughters of the American Revolution. In response, Mrs. Roosevelt resigned from the organization and organized a concert on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, where Marian Anderson performed in front of 75,000 people on Easter Sunday. Assessing the impact of the New Deal on women, historian Alan Brinkley writes, the New Deal was not hostile to feminist aspirations, but neither did it do a great deal to advance them. One big development for women was the appointment of Frances Perkins as the Secretary of Labor, making her the first female cabinet secretary in American history. She would serve the entire Roosevelt presidency. He also named dozens of women to lower levels of the government, oftentimes after receiving pressure from his wife. During the Great Depression, it was common for women to give up their jobs so that men could fill those roles. New Deal agencies offered few opportunities for women. 90% of Black families compared to 50% of white families experienced poverty during the Great Depression. African Americans were usually the first ones fired and last ones hired. The menial jobs that were available to many African Americans during the 1920s went to unemployed white workers during the Great Depression. African Americans oftentimes found themselves excluded from the loan, relief, and insurance programs that were key parts of the New Deal. The CCC segregated camps by race. The NRA allowed for black workers to be paid less than their white counterparts, and the FHA refused to allow mortgages to African Americans. FDR's Federal Council of Negro Affairs, better known as his Black Cabinet, advised the president on issues that were important to Black Americans. It was during the Roosevelt administration that we see the African American vote start to go overwhelmingly for the Democratic Party. I have this image in my head from Dr. Kevin Borg, the professor I worked for at JMU, who would say that in the average African American household, they replaced the picture of Abraham Lincoln with one of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. To go back to historian Alan Brinkley one more time, he writes, while the New Deal was not hostile to African Americans and it did much to help them advance, but it refused to make the issue of race a significant part of its agenda. Under the leadership of John Collier as the commissioner for the Bureau of Indian Affairs, there was finally effort at the national level to reverse the policies of assimilation that had been part of the relationship between Native Americans and first Europeans and then Americans in North America. Collier emphasized the importance of preserving tribal culture, something that the 1887 Dawes Act sought to eliminate. The Indian Reorganization Act, signed by the president in 1934, gave Native Americans the right to own land collectively once again. Tribal lands increased by 4 million acres. Now, this is a small percentage of the 90 million acres taken through the Dawes Act, but it was a step in the right direction. And Native American farm income increased from $2 million in 1932 to $49 million in 1947. During FDR's first 4 years in office, there were signs that the economy was starting to recover. You can see in the chart that unemployment had fallen to 14% and GDP was significantly higher in 1937. But what you will also notice is what happened to those numbers in 1938. This period is known as the Roosevelt Recession. Thinking that the economy was on the verge of recovery and focusing on balancing the budget, FDR slowed spending during this time. It seemed that consumers were not spending their new income, they were saving it. By 1938, opposition in Congress grew to the New Deal, making it difficult for FDR to get any major program through Congress. In the 1938 midterm elections, Democrats lost 72 seats in the House of Representatives and 7 seats in the Senate, dramatically decreasing their majority. World events were starting to become more and more important by 1938. The Japanese were moving in Asia, and Hitler was starting his move through Europe. We will cover these events next time. If you are looking at the image on the right and are thinking, I have seen drawings that look like this in books I might have read when I was younger. You did. Dr. Seuss drew pictures of Nazi woodpeckers attacking Europe while the big American bird does nothing before drawing Sam I Am's exploits trying to convince random creatures to eat green eggs and ham. We will look at more of Dr. Seuss's World War II images in Chapter 26. Let's close the show with a quick assessment of the New Deal. Roosevelt increased the power of the federal government through his New Deal. It permanently changed the role the government plays in the economy. There has not been a period since where we saw the more laissez-faire policies of the Gilded Age in the 1920s. This is not to say that both parties do not have differing views on the role of the government in the economy. My point is, there is not as much contrast now as there was when FDR took the reins from Herbert Hoover in 1933. The New Deal also changed attitudes toward the responsibility of the government to assist people. As I said earlier, the New Deal ushered in a federal welfare state. Now, this too is a source of debate between the parties, but gone were the days of the federal government being reluctant to help the neediest Americans. There are a lot of New Deal agencies that still exist. The FDIC still protects your bank deposits. Social Security is still there for older voters. The Fair Labor Standards Act tells your boss that they have to pay you at least $7.25 an hour. And the SEC is still watching the stock market. The last question to consider is, was the New Deal successful? Yes, it built up American infrastructure and reinstilled confidence in the banking system. And while it didn't reduce unemployment, unemployment was still 17% when FDR was elected to an unprecedented third term in 1940. Ultimately, it was not the New Deal that ended the Great Depression. It was the conversion of the American economy to wartime production during the 1940s that would bring the Great Depression to an end. Unemployment was down to 4.7% by 1942 and 1.2% by 1944. But it was the New Deal that inspired confidence into a reeling American people, that breathed life into a failing economy, and that brought changes and reforms that are still central to the way our democracy functions in the 21st century. Success or failure depends on the metric used by the assessor. Next time, we will look at all of the foreign policy between the world wars, considering the change in American foreign policy from a more isolationist position in 1919 to a fully interventionist foreign policy in 1941. Lee and Luke, say goodbye to these fine people.
Goodbye.
Tell Gavin to cut his hair.
Gavin, cut your hair.
Good night, Albuquerque.